There is a pile behind a hog barn in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas that, for 3 winters, nobody could explain. Truckloads of wet mango seed husks, gray-brown and slick, stacked higher than a man, steaming faintly on cold mornings like something alive underneath. Flies in July thick enough to hear from the road. The neighbors called it the mango dump. Nobody asked why a woman who ran 40 acres of scrubby cotton ground outside the town of Delphina, Texas, would let a cannery keep dropping its garbage on her property for free. The answer, when she finally gave it, was that she wasn't letting them dump garbage. She was buying seed. Her name was Carol Ann Vasick, 54 years old, and up until 4 years before the pile appeared, she had never grown so much as a windowsill tomato on purpose. She'd spent 26 years doing books for a cotton gin outside Harlingen, married to a man named Russell who ran the gin's scale house, and when the gin finally closed for good in the spring the year she turned 50, Russell took the severance, took most of the furniture, and moved to Corpus Christi with a woman from the co-op insurance office. Carol Ann kept the house and the 40 acres that had come down through her mother's people, ground too small and too worn out to interest any of the big cotton operations that had been buying up the valley. She had no plan. She had a mortgage, a part-time bookkeeping client in McAllen, and a lot of quiet. The mango angle came from her cousin Deb, who worked quality control at a fruit processing plant in nearby Mission that pitted, sliced, and canned mangoes trucked up from Mexico for the syrup and juice market. Deb mentioned, almost as a complaint, that the plant was paying a hauling company good money every week to cart off tons of seed and skin waste to the county landfill, and the landfill was getting stingier about taking it because it rotted and stank and drew vermin. Carol Ann asked an odd question for a woman with no farming background. What kind of mangoes were those seeds from? Deb didn't know exactly. Old varieties, she said, not the supermarket kind, brought in from small growers across the border who still ran heirloom trees, the ones with names like Manila, Atulfo cousins, Criollo types, nobody had bothered to patent or standardize. The plant didn't care what variety went into the vats. A mango was a mango to them once it was pulp. Carol Ann drove out to the plant on a Tuesday and asked the shift manager if she could take the seed waste off their hands instead of them paying to haul it. He looked at her like she'd asked to take his garbage disposal home in a bucket, which in a sense she had. He said sure, save us the hauling fee, and didn't ask why. That was the whole negotiation. No contract, just a nod and a diesel truck route that from then on ended at her place instead of the landfill, 3 days a week, free of charge to her, saving the plant real money on tipping fees. Everyone who heard about it assumed she'd lost her mind, or lost enough of her mind from the divorce that a pile of rotting mango pits seemed like company. What she was actually after, in her own half-formed way, was the seeds. A mango pit, cracked open, holds a single large seed. A nut, technically, though people call it a seed, and unlike a lot of fruit trees, mango trees grown from certain seed types come up true to the parent, or close enough to be usable, especially the polyembryonic varieties common in the Criollo and Southeast Asian lines that made up much of what that plant was processing. Carol Ann didn't know the word polyembryonic when she started. She learned it 8 months in, from a man named Efrain Salcido, and it turned out to be the single most important word in her whole business. The first winter she just tried to grow the things, no method, no research beyond a stack of library books on tropical fruit she barely understood. She scooped seeds out of the pile with garden gloves, rinsed them in a stock tank, and pushed them into black nursery pots of straight garden dirt she'd hauled in from her own worn-out cotton field. 90% of them rotted. She didn't yet know that a mango seed has to be extracted from its tough outer husk, the actual pit shell, within a few days of the fruit being processed, while it's still viable, and that the inner seed, once exposed, is fragile and needs to go into a well-draining, sterile medium almost immediately or fungus takes it before it ever sprouts. Garden dirt from a cotton field, full of old herbicide residue and clay that held water like a bathtub, drowned nearly everything she planted. She lost close to 1,400 seeds that first attempt, and had maybe 40 spindly seedlings to show for it by spring, half of which died anyway from a cold snap in February because she hadn't thought to cover them, not understanding that mango seedlings, unlike the cotton and citrus she'd grown up around, cannot tolerate frost at all, not even a light one, not even for an hour. Her second big failure was scale. Word had gotten around, not that she was building a business, just that Carol Ann Vasick had gone strange and was growing mango trees behind her house. And by the second summer, she had close to 600 seedlings crowded onto a quarter-acre of raised beds she'd built herself out of scrap lumber from the old gin. She had no shade structure. South Texas summer sun, without any canopy over young mango starts, scorched the leaves of nearly 200 of them past recovery in a single 10-day heat spell, the kind of dry valley heat that regularly tops 105. She hadn't understood that mango seedlings, for their first year, actually want dappled light, not full sun, until they've built enough root mass and thicker leaves to handle it. That was a hard, expensive lesson in shade cloth, and by then, she'd also learned the hauling truck wasn't free labor for her. Sorting good pits from moldy ones, cracking each husk by hand with a rubber mallet and a chisel, took her 4 to 5 hours a day she wasn't being paid for, on top of her bookkeeping client. It was around then, in the fall of her second year, that she met Efrain Salcido, and the shape of the whole thing changed. Efrain was 71, a retired grower who'd run a commercial mango orchard across the river near Reynosa for almost 40 years before arthritis in both hands ended his working life, and he moved north to live with a daughter in Mission. He heard about the crazy woman with the mango pile from his daughter's hairdresser, of all people, and drove out one Saturday morning uninvited, parked his truck at the gate, and stood looking at Carol Ann's rows for a long time without saying anything. She thought he was there to complain about the smell. Instead, he picked up one of her seedlings, turned the root ball out of the pot with 2 fingers, looked at the roots, and said, in accented but precise English, "You are killing them slow instead of fast. That is worse." Then he left. She chased him down 2 weeks later at his daughter's house and asked him, flat out, to teach her, and offered to pay him, which he refused, though eventually he let her cover his gas money and buy him lunch when he came out, which became a habit, Thursdays mostly, for the better part of 2 years. The first real thing he taught her was about polyembryony. Some mango varieties, he explained, produce seeds that contain multiple embryos, sometimes 3, 4, even 6 inside one seed, and most of those embryos are genetically identical clones of the mother tree, not cross-pollinated hybrids like an apple seed would be. 1 or 2 embryos in the cluster might be a true sexual seedling, different from the parent, but the rest come up true. That's why certain mango types could be seed propagated reliably at all, something almost no other major fruit tree allows. The Criollo and Indo-Chinese type mangoes that made up most of what that Mission cannery was processing, grown from small orchards across the border where growers hadn't bothered grafting everything to commercial clones, were heavily polyembryonic. That was the accident buried in Carol Ann's garbage pile. She wasn't sitting on random compost, she was sitting on thousands of seeds with a real chance of growing into productive, true-to-type heirloom trees, types that had all but vanished from commercial nurseries because the whole American mango trade had consolidated around a handful of grafted, patented cultivars sold at big box stores. Efrain taught her to split a seed cluster carefully with a clean utility knife once the shell was off, looking for the thicker, more vigorous-looking embryos, and to discard the thin, pale ones that were usually the weaker sexual seedlings. He taught her that seed viability dropped fast. Within 5 to 7 days of the fruit being processed, germination rates could fall from near 90% to under 30%, which meant her arrangement with the plant, 3 pickups a week instead of 1 big weekly haul, was actually critical, not just convenient. He taught her to use a coarse mix of perlite, pine bark fines, and coarse sand instead of garden soil, something that drained in under 10 seconds when you poured a cup of water through a fistful of it, because mango roots rot in wet, heavy medium faster than almost anything else he'd grown. And he taught her the mallet and chisel method was wrong too. She was cracking a third of her seeds by hitting them square, splitting the embryo along with the husk. He showed her to score the husk along its seam with a hacksaw blade, just enough to weaken it, then pry it open with a flathead screwdriver, like opening a stubborn oyster, protecting the seed inside. Even with all that, failures kept coming, each one different, which Ephraim seemed to expect and never sugar-coated. Her third year, she lost almost a full month's worth of good seedlings, better than 300 trees, to a fungal issue called anthracnose that showed up as black lesions on the young stems during a wet, humid August. She hadn't been watering from overhead, she'd been careful about that, but she'd crowded the beds too close together again, restricting airflow, and the spores had spread bed to bed before she even noticed the first blackened stem. Ephraim walked the rows with her, pulled every infected plant himself despite his hands, had her burn them rather than compost them, and told her, "Space is not wasted land, space is medicine." She widened every bed after that to 18 inches between pots minimum, and never had an outbreak that size again. Her fourth failure was a market failure, not a growing one. By her third spring, she had close to 400 healthy, well-rooted mango trees, a foot to 18 inches tall in 1-gallon pots. True heirloom types from named Criollo lines Ephraim could identify almost by the shape and color of the fruit skin left clinging to the husk. A soft yellow-green Adolfo type, a blushed red one he called by a Spanish name that translated roughly to Little Rose, a fiber-light variety popular in home orchards across Mexico that almost nobody in Texas nurseries carried. She loaded 30 of them into her truck and drove to a regional garden expo in Harlingen, expecting nurserymen and landscapers to be thrilled. Instead, she got politely turned away by 3 different wholesale buyers who told her, not unkindly, that they only bought grafted trees with documented fruiting timelines and consistent size, because customers wanted to know exactly what they were getting and how many years to first fruit. A seed-grown mango tree, even a true-to-type one, carries more variability than a grafted clone, and the wholesale nursery trade didn't trust it, didn't have a slot on the shelf tag for probably true to parent, we think. She came home with 28 trees still in the truck bed and a real dent in her confidence, the kind that made her wonder if Ephraim's Thursdays and her own 18 months of learning had been aimed at a market that didn't exist. The break, when it came, was small and almost embarrassing in hindsight, the way most first sales are. A woman from her own church, who kept a big vegetable garden and had heard about Carol Ann's mango trees through the same grapevine that had once just called it the mango dump, asked if she could buy one for her grandson's birthday, since he loved mangoes and she'd always wanted to try growing one in a big pot on her patio, dragging it inside for the 2 or 3 nights a year it might frost. Carol Ann sold her a 14-inch seedling for $12, barely covering the cost of the pot and soil mix, and thought nothing of it. Then the woman brought her a photo 8 months later of the tree, thriving, and mentioned to 3 more people at church that Carol Ann had real mango trees, heirloom ones, cheap. By the following spring, she'd sold 60 trees that way, one at a time, all word of mouth, all patio-scale customers who had no interest in wholesale specs and just wanted something unusual growing in their yard that a landscaper down the road didn't carry. That patio tree market taught her something Ephraim hadn't needed to teach her, because he'd only ever grown commercially, home gardeners in South Texas, and it turned out much further afield once she started shipping, were hungry for dooryard fruit trees with a story attached, a named heirloom variety, a bit of history about where the seed came from, something that felt more like heritage than product. She started tagging each tree with the variety name Ephraim gave her and a line about its origin, a small Mexican orchard family whose fruit had been trucked north for juice for decades, its genetics otherwise headed for a landfill, People liked buying something rescued. Growth after that came in a chain, each stage built on the one before, rather than jumping ahead of what she could support. The church sales led her to set up a folding table at the Mission Farmers Market on Saturdays, starting with just 15 trees at a time in her truck bed, and there she found her second real audience: home canners, hobby cooks, and a handful of small-scale chutney and hot sauce makers who wanted the fruit itself, not just the tree, once her oldest seedlings, the original batch from that first disastrous winter, the survivors, began fruiting in year 4 and 5. A mango seedling tree typically takes 4 to 6 years to first fruit, sometimes longer, which was longer than most impatient customers wanted to wait. But it gave Carol Ann her own supply of true heirloom fruit to sell alongside the trees, something almost nobody else at that market had. The farmer's market led, in her 5th year, to her first real commercial account. Not a grand distributor contract, but a single small restaurant in McAllen, a chef named Priya Bhatt, who ran a wood-fired place doing Tex-Mex adjacent food with a South Asian bent, who tasted Carol Ann's fruit off the market table one Saturday and asked where on earth she was growing an actual Criollo mango with that kind of floral sweetness, because it tasted nothing like the fibrous grocery store mangoes she'd grown up buying. Priya started buying 40 to 60 pounds of fruit a week in season, and more importantly, started buying trees too, for a small dooryard orchard she was planting behind the restaurant to use as a marketing hook, and told other chefs about it. By year 6, Carol Ann had outgrown doing everything herself. She hired a part-time worker, a 19-year-old named Tobias Reyna from down the road, who'd been laid off from a warehouse job in McAllen, and taught him the husk scoring and embryo splitting method Ephraim had taught her, passing the trade forward the same patient, exact way it had come to her: score along the seam, never crack it square, discard the thin pale embryos, pot within 3 days in the coarse mix, water from below. She built 3 simple shade houses out of PVC pipe and 40% shade cloth, having learned from her scorched batch years earlier exactly how much light young mango starts could and couldn't take. She set up an online order form for trees, shipped bare root or small potted starts to customers as far as Florida and coastal California who wanted a true heirloom seedling instead of the same 3 grafted cultivars every big box store carried. The Cannery and Mission became, without either side ever calling it that, her supplier and her partner. What had once been a free-hauling arrangement to save the plant a tipping fee turned, once her volumes and her public profile grew, a local news segment about "The Mango Lady of Delphina Didn't Hurt," into a small paid contract, 25 cents a pound, for sorted, fresh seed, delivered within 48 hours of processing, instead of the old 3 times a week dump and take. The shift manager who'd shrugged and nodded that first Tuesday now called her directly when a new grower's fruit came through the line with seed types she hadn't seen before, because he'd learned she'd pay a little more for anything unusual, and because it beat paying the landfill. Ephraim Salcido died in the spring of her 7th year, at 78, from complications after a fall, and Carol Ann closed the operation for 3 days, something she'd never done even during a hurricane scare, to sit with his family and to walk her own rows alone in the early mornings, the way they used to walk them together on Thursdays. The thing he'd told her most often, so often it had become almost a joke between them, was that a mango tree does not care how badly you want it to hurry. She had heard it 100 times as an old man's stubborn patience talking, a kind of gentle scolding when she was anxious about slow germination or a slow season. It was only after he was gone, watching a batch of 6-year-old trees she'd almost given up on, finally load down with fruit that spring, heavier and better than any batch before it, that she understood he hadn't been telling her to be patient as a virtue. He'd been telling her the actual biology of it, that a seedling tree builds its root architecture and its hormonal maturity on its own internal clock, unrelated to fertilizer, unrelated to how much water or care you threw at it, and that pushing it faster with heavy feeding, the mistake she'd made more than once trying to force early growth, only produced soft, disease-prone wood. Slow was not the failure mode. Slow was the method. Today, Carol Ann's operation, which she still calls, with a straight face, Vasek Heirloom Mango, sits on 11 of her original 40 acres, the rest still leased out for hay to a neighbor. She runs close to 2,000 trees a year through her shade houses at various stages, sells retail trees online and at 3 regional farmers markets, supplies fruit in season to 6 restaurants across the valley, including Priya's, and ships bare root seedlings nationally every spring to customers who've read about her online. Her revenue last year cleared just over $110,000, most of it after 4 solid years of reinvesting nearly everything back into shade structures, a small refrigerated cooler for fruit storage, and Tobias's wages, who is now full-time and learning, slowly and specifically, the way she once did, which pale thin embryos to discard, and which thick ones are worth the gamble. The pile behind the hog barn is gone now, replaced by neat rows of black nursery pots under white shade cloth that hums faintly in the valley wind. The Cannery truck still comes 3 times a week, but now it's a business truck, logged and paid, driven by a man who knows to hand the crates directly to Tobias instead of dumping them, because a bruised seed is a seed with fungus by Thursday. People still drive slow past the fence sometimes, the way they used to when it was just a stinking mystery pile, except now they're looking at rows of small trees tagged with names like Criollo Rosado and Manila Dorado, trying to figure out how a woman with a cotton gin bookkeeping background ended up growing the rarest mango genetics in South Texas out of what her own cannery used to pay a hauling company to throw away. Even now, with the business steady and her name known past the county line, Carol Ann kept a habit that Ephraim would have recognized. Every Thursday morning, whether or not there was anyone left to teach her, she walked the rows alone before Tobias arrived, checking leaf color, checking for the fine white webbing of spider mites that could take hold in a dry spring, checking the drainage holes on the oldest pots to make sure roots hadn't circled and choked themselves, a condition called being pot-bound that she'd learned the hard way in her 4th year, when a whole bench of otherwise healthy 2-year-old trees stalled out and yellowed because she'd left them in 1-gallon pots 8 months too long. She'd had to explain that failure to a customer who'd bought 6 trees and watched them sit motionless in his yard for a season, and the honesty of that conversation, telling him exactly what she'd done wrong and giving him 2 replacement trees at no charge, did more for her reputation locally than any advertising could have. People in a small place remember who tells them the truth about a mistake instead of hiding it, and word of that spread the same slow, reliable way the mango dump stories once had, except now it was working for her instead of against her. She had also, by her 8th year, started something Ephraim never lived to see but that she suspected would have pleased him more than the revenue numbers did. A Saturday morning class, 4 times a year, capped at 12 people, teaching home gardeners how to extract, split, and germinate their own mango seed from grocery store fruit, using the same hacksaw and screwdriver method he'd shown her, the same coarse perlite and bark mix, the same warning about polyembryonic clusters and which embryos to keep. She charged $40 a head, which covered her time and the folding tables, and she gave every student a small potted seedling to take home, already a few weeks old, so they wouldn't leave empty-handed if their own first attempt failed the way hers had. Most of the supermarket mangoes people brought in weren't polyembryonic at all. They were grafted commercial cultivars like Tommy Atkins or Kent, which produce monoembryonic seed, a single sexual embryo that grows into something genetically different from the parent tree, often inferior in flavor. And part of what she taught, gently, was how to tell the difference before they wasted a year of hope on a seed that was never going to come up true. It surprised people every time. It had surprised her. Tobias Reyna, for his part, had started talking about leasing 4 acres of his own from his grandfather's place down the road, wanting to try growing out some of the more unusual Criollo lines Ephraim had once pointed out to Carol Ann, but that she'd never had bench space to bother with. a small-fruited, intensely aromatic type Ephraim used to call, half-joking, the perfume mango, because a single ripe fruit could scent an entire room. Carol Ann told him if he wanted cuttings and seeds, she'd give them to him for nothing, on one condition, which was that he write down what he learned the way she wished she'd written things down in her first 2 years, instead of trusting it all to memory and Ephraim's patience. He'd laughed, but he'd also gone out and bought a notebook, and she'd seen him filling pages of it some evenings after the shade houses were locked up, in the same cramped, careful handwriting his own grandmother used for her recipe cards. The Cannery in Mission, for its part, had quietly stopped calling the arrangement waste management at all. The shift manager, a heavy-set man named Delfino Ibarra, who'd been there the whole 7 years, had taken to walking new hires past the loading dock on their first day and telling them, with something close to pride, that the seed crates going out on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays weren't garbage. They were going to become somebody's mango tree in Florida or California within the year, grown by a woman who used to keep books for a cotton gin and didn't know a rootstock from a fence post when she started. It had become, in its own small way, a story the plant told about itself, proof that not everything coming off that line was simply pulp and peel and pit, destined for a landfill. Nobody wanted to keep taking it. As for Carol Ann, she still didn't call herself a farmer, not exactly, and she still kept her bookkeeping client in McAllen out of habit more than need, doing the woman's ledgers on Tuesday afternoons, the same as she had for 15 years, because there was something steadying in a column of numbers that added up clean, a comfort she'd carried over from her old life into her new one without ever quite meaning to. But when people asked her, at the farmer's market or the garden expo she now got invited to as a speaker instead of turned away from, what she actually did for a living, she didn't say bookkeeper anymore, and she didn't say she grew mango trees either. She said she grew mangoes that were supposed to be garbage, and mostly left it at that, letting the trees behind her, heavy with fruit that had no business existing outside a truckload of cannery waste, finish the explanation for her.